Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, Reseed, it is a project that we are just about to wrap up. We are just completing the final reporting, and it was an interesting call that came a couple of years from the European Commission that wanted to know what is actually the risk of European socioeconomic sectors for climate change features that actually happen far outside the borders of the European domain. And so you can then I'll come with a couple of examples later in the presentation, but it was an interesting combination because I think a year or maybe 1.5 years before, we came together with a couple of scientists, where Jana was there as well, and maybe some others in the audience was there. And that is where we're discussing the notion of what the complexity or the limitations to make sense of future conditions and future scenarios with the common frameworks for climate scenario development and climate impact assessment and maybe even climate policy evaluation. We felt that the underlying assumptions of these big scenario programs and all the uncertainties that are inherent in the models themselves, but also in the selection of combined features, that uncertainty is so large that it is actually not feasible at all to make a probabilistic estimate of what is the chance that Europe will be hit by some kind of an economic repercussion of a major climate event far outside its borders. That is probabilistic reasoning that is normally underlying risk-based approaches or risk-based policymaking falls apart if you are getting to very complex features. And the workshop that we had in the UK, led by Ted Shepard, was about making storylines of much more isolated or much more constrained features like individual weather events. And I don't know whom of you knows this movie. You can raise your hand, but I can't see it. But this movie Lola Rent is a very nice metaphor of what a storyline approach, as I will explain in a minute later, was actually entails. Because if you think about an extreme event that had an enormous cascading set of impacts, we can always wonder, of course, how that event would have materialized, how it would have occurred, if something somewhere in that long chain would have been different. And so you can imagine that we have a big event somewhere and it has some kind of an impact chain, and in the end it reaches Europe and there is a noticeable impact. That whole event chain would have been different if it would have occurred under a different climate condition. And that is actually at the heart of the storyline developments that we do. And Lola Rent is a movie. It's from Tom Tykwer, a German cinematographer. He went to Hollywood later, but I think this was his examination movie. And it is from mid-90s or so, early 90s. And it's about a lady that gets a phone call very early in the movie, and her boyfriend is in trouble. And so she runs to the place where the boyfriend is, and he's somewhere downtown somewhere. And then, of course, she goes out of the corridors and stumbles over the staircase over a dog that is just coming by. And then on the sidewalk, she also has to bypass a car or whatever. And she's just at the time of arrival of where the boyfriend is, she just sees that guy standing with his hands up with the police pointing a gun at him. And so he has been engaged in some kind of robbery kind of situation. We don't exactly know what it is. Then the movie stops and it's replayed again. And we again see Lola, that's the lady's name, get a phone call at the beginning, starting to run. But this time the dog isn't there. So she has 2 seconds extra gain on her travel. Also on the sidewalk, that car isn't there. So she's there earlier at the scene. And she can just hold her boyfriend away from entering the store to commit that robbery. And the third one is the opposite, and that's even more delayed, and that's actually a fatal. But it's the artwork of the movie is not that great, but it's really the notion is intriguing because you see repetitions of scenes all the way through the movie, all the way running, but slightly different. A slightly different timing of the passenger that comes by, etc. And that sort of sketches quite nicely what we intend with this storyline. Long story short, one reason to look at remote impacts, we have in the project we've dealt with quite a few of those, and now we'll come to there. But just as an example, what happened in the recent past is a major disturbance of the food security in the Horn of Africa due to a major locust outbreak in the 2018-19 season. There is all kinds of other disruptions, but in that particular case in 2019, there was an analysis carried out by people at PIC Potsdam on what actually that locust outbreak did to food security in that area, etc. But the story is not too comprehensive here, but they also they captured the entire event of that locust outbreak in a worldwide encompassing food trade system where, of course, suppliers of food and receivers of food are all captured in that analysis. And in that story with the locust, it shows that a locust outbreak on top of a crisis that's already there because of food disruption somewhere else can, of course, aggravate the situation extremely strongly. And what was done in the storyline that we had here is that locust outbreak, that was a situation that stood on itself and had already quite a big impact on the food security, of course, in the Horn of Africa. But there was a counterfactual scenario was created for that same outbreak. But then that locust outbreak was actually combined with an event where food supply was already impaired because of another, say, climatic disruption somewhere else, like the 2010 heat wave in Europe or 2007-8 global void of supply. And then we saw that, of course, that the impact of that local outbreak would be much larger because of shortages of storages or even reduced supply chains. And with this kind of analysis, one can also test what happens if you have different, say, policies to mitigate it. And here in that analysis, they also looked at what happens to policies on constraining exports. When in a certain area food supply is impaired, is reduced, if then of course countries start shutting down their export export boundaries because they don't want to create even larger problems for their own population, one can imagine that the downstream impacts are even larger than without that import restriction. So you can also, in that approach, if you have a good model set up to simulate all these events, you can also test alternative scenarios for interventions to look at. Well, and that is this has also a big impact on Europe. There's other examples as well, because of course Europe has a large share of the humanitarian aid and to the development aid in that area, and so there's a large call to European supplies to provide a remedy to the big disaster. So also that is where Europe is sensitive to impacts that happen outside this border. But the project was actually, yeah, normally you read a research call from a European program and you start reasoning from what is actually the problem that was at stake. Here it was actually the other way around. Here we had already thought about a methodology to approach very complex situations with long cascading change. And here actually we saw an application domain where we could test our methodology. So our project proposal had a very strong emphasis also on the development of that storyline methodology. So that's a very prominent element of the project. Of course, apart from that, we also did a lot of illustrations of these European sensitivities, because that was, of course, what was called from the call. And we did it for a couple of different sectors. And we also produced quite a bit of outreach and papers and some policy recommendations out of it. But the methodological part was actually quite central, certainly in the early phases of the project, to our thinking and activities. Yeah, and again, if I try to catch this storyline methodology in a nutshell, of course, a storyline is also, again, a buzzword. Everybody is doing storytelling nowadays, and we all know about scenarios. The upper right figure clearly shows a very well-known figure that we know that dependent on the scenario of global greenhouse emissions, global temperature is going to either follow a high path when emissions are high, or a more modest warming rate if emissions are lower. Well, and the underlying storylines behind these scenarios is, of course, the global development and the global emission patterns that depend on the global socioeconomic structure, technology, wealth, etc. So those storylines are very common. The storylines is underlying the scenario. On the lower right side, you see another scenario study, actually, and that was in the Netherlands, where we had a very extreme summer rainfall event in August 2010. And this is just a rainfall pattern, and it had a large, quite a big of impact in the water management area in the center of the Netherlands. And there was a lot of questioning about, okay, but what has climate change got to do with to this, and what would, say, climate change do to these kinds of events? And this is where we, piloted this concept of what we call this pseudo global warming experiment. We have a limited area model that is encompassing this area that you see, or a bit larger, but we run that model with lateral boundary conditions that are very similar to what happens in the real world from reanalysis, and we really could reproduce the observed event pretty well with that limited area model. But now we reran that future of that same event, but now we imposed higher temperatures and also different moisture profiles, matching a 2-degree warmer world than we have today. And then we see the event evolve like on the right-hand pattern. And of course, in this case, precipitation was intensified a lot because not only the temperature was high, but also the amount of humidity that was converging to the area was higher. But more interestingly, it was also a huge impact difference, because now you see that the area where the extreme rainfall is occurring is really spread out to a much larger domain. Much larger areas are covered by real extreme rainfall. And now we suddenly see that where local management used to be sort of sufficient to manage the event in the left-hand side of the picture, on the right-hand side, we see now that lots of other water management units had to deal with lots of water at the same time. They had to rely on shared resources at the same time. And this was all like a virtual study. But for, say, emergency response people, this was really an eye-opening situation. Hang on, we are now not just on our own to mitigate this extreme event. We have now got to cooperate with our neighbors, because they rely on the same kind of infrastructure to get rid of water and to get fire people into the area as we do. And that is actually one of the purposes of that study. But that was already 2012, 13, 14 or so. And that was what we brought into that workshop. The left-hand picture actually shows a bit the traditional cascading, how we bring it from the large scale to the small scale. And in the climate scenario, what we normally do on the left-hand side, we see the combination of say, the amount of climate forcings, the emissions or the concentrations, together with the climate sensitivity. They set the scene for the global warming. And then at the global scale, we see that both dynamical and the circulation can change, but also regional warming can induce by thermodynamic responses and local land-atmosphere feedbacks, etc. And that the combination of the dynamics and the thermodynamics, which is the regional part, they form the hazard. And then, of course, with exposure vulnerability together, that comes to the impact. And in the upper right figure, we see that all the dark blue things are fixed. We just prescribe those, and all the light blue things are allowed to interact responsive to these external forces. And in fact, for the event scenario that we put on the bottom, we do a similar thing, but we constrain different elements of this cascade. And now again, the dark blue ones are fixed. And this time we not only fix the global warming, but also the dynamical conditions. We just prescribe the weather patterns, but the only thing that we change is that regional response, the regional warming and the consequent intensification of the rainfall. So we get a different hazard. But in a way, it's pretty similar, but we just change the liberty of the scenario, if you like, and we constrain it much closer to the actual event. And yeah, the interesting thing from also more like a social, psychological, or even philosophical story is that whenever you're able to make scenarios that are very closely resembling to something that people have already experienced in the past, that of course has a very prominent influence on the way people appreciate the knowledge of it. And it's also already a very old Chinese saying. They say, "Oh, if I just hear something, I'll forget. If I see it, I will remember. But if I enter my activities and do a stress testing, then I really understand." So it is actually a way to bring this kind of events much closer to the real world context of people that have to deal with this kind of crisis. Well, this is a bit of the philosophy. We set up that project by for a couple of sectors, thinking of a lot of potential storylines or a lot of events that we experienced in the recent past, or we could figure out of which areas on the world are, say, what we would call hotspot regions where climate features can occur that will very likely or have a large potential to trigger socioeconomic features in Europe. And so we define hotspot areas outside of Europe on the downside of this cartoon. We have an event where we saw how that teleconnects to the impacts in Europe via the outer line. And then we run that very same event. We capture that event in some kind of a modeling framework, and I'm coming back to that later, in order to sort of reproduce what happened in the real world. And that allowed us to also make perturbations to that event, for instance, by taking different climate change assumptions. But we also had other perturbations like that. And that is how and then we can have different stories to tell that are alternative stories, or what we call counterfactuals, compared to the story that happened in the real world. That methodology, we really invested quite a bit of it, and it was necessary because this was a very multidisciplinary approach. Of course, we have a lot of physicists, but also trade and economists and agronomists and policymaker experts, etc. So we had to take a lot of time to actually understand each other, to connect our own to our methodological approaches or connect models, etc. And it was really quite a job to convey or to get a unanimous picture of what this storyline concept actually is about. But we really produced a few methodological scientific publications to get there. We also successfully, I think, got to reach out to what is called the European Climate Risk Assessment, an activity that is nearly finished by the European Environment Agency to make a risk assessment for Europe. And they also pick up that idea of storylines. And we also inspired some others with these publications. And I think we trained a couple of early career scientists, the PhDs that worked on this, that are now really, growing up with that context of storyline development. One thing that was really necessary to do during the methodological stage is to sort of standardize the approach a bit. And that is, of course, a bit difficult if you can, there's so many degrees of freedom and there's so many domains where events can happen somewhere that have a socioeconomic impact. And for different sectors, you have totally different stories, different timelines, different aggregation skills, etc. But still, we did want to uniformize the approach. And so we really put together some kind of a protocol that systematically asks the questions on scoping, the definition of the hazard region, a definition of what the impact transmission is about, what is the impact. We thought about how to perturb climate conditions, because actually the heart of the method is that we allow comparison of multiple variants of the Lola Rent figures in order to really learn what climate has to do with these kind of sensitivities. That is, I think, the ultimate goal of the approach, being able to replay an event with a different, in this case, climate setting or a different policy intervention setting, and that is where you take the learning from. And that is what was documented in the paper as well. And also we ranked or we put some criteria on the selection steps. We need to make a lot of assumptions and a lot of selections of what hotspots and what teleconnections. And so we also had some criteria. It has to be realistic. We have to be demonstrating that the tools that we use are able to describe the real world. For instance, weather forecast models that are doing a good job in real weather forecasts are eligible for this kind of jobs. Of course, we look at relevance. So we had a lot of scoping and stakeholder interaction to see what is the kind of events that make sense and what are the kind of counterfactuals that make sense. And again, we want to be risk informative. It's not just a story because we are fond of telling stories, so nothing wrong with that, but it is also intended to inform about some part of your risk profile, and not necessarily solely by doing probabilistic statements, although some of the elements do have a probabilistic assessment as well. We do sometimes explore not just 3 counterfactuals, but within storyline we take like 50 different versions of a storm to build a bit of a PDF, and then we perturb that PDF in a counterfactual to see what then is happening. Yeah, and I think we documented this, and we had lots of internal and review discussions. Some papers took 2 years to get reviewed. For instance, the top one here, because we had this was a very philosophical paper that really tears about, okay, when is this approach really adding to your already probabilistic assessment, and when, but how does it depend on your values or on your picture of what science has to do with it? So a bit of a philosophical statement. Yeah, we had thorough documentation of the methodology and a good set of practical guidance lines that we also documented in it. Yeah, a few examples. Maybe I should wrap up already there. I'll skip one if you don't mind, and I'm not sure if the author of this one is in there, but indeed, what we had. In total 15 or so different storylines distributed over 5 sectors. So we had quite a large collection of different approaches and different models. Many of them have been published in science, in scientific literature as well. So they have been also exposed to external reviews, and there's a lot of benchmarking of methodologies and justification of those. But we had all kinds of different approaches. Now, I think I showed 2 or 3 of them to just give an illustration of the differences in data sets and model approaches that we brought into the picture. One of them is on the sensitivity of European food production to, say, soy imports, and the major soy production areas are in the Americas, the US, and the tropical Brazil and the Argentina area. There was in 2008, was it 2012? 2012, I believe, there was a major deficiency in production of soy because of a contemporary drought-induced and ENSO-related decline in soybean production in all areas, and that was really a spike in prices of worldwide soybean markets, but also all kinds of effects on labor conditions. Economic turnovers in Europe and companies that got bankrupt, etc. And so that was a story that we were telling. We looked a lot at, we built quite a lot of evidence on what is actually climate change doing to these regions, and is climate change indeed promoting drought conditions, for instance, that are detrimental to soybean. We even looked at compounding heat stress and droughts that plays a role here. We also could say that drought problems for instance, in Brazil is not a very prominent feature, but in the US and Argentina, it's a much more prominent response there. But that is so on the fiscal part. But on the socioeconomic part, a lot of modeling was done, particularly by the people from YASA, not on the trade volumes, on the prices, the production of food for cattle, price fluctuations, etc. So there was a large impact assessment. But interestingly, we also tested a couple of alternative policy scenarios, because soybean is of course not free of what is it? It is a bit contested nowadays because there's a lot of deforestation associated to it. So one of the counterfactual scenarios that we run was, let's suppose that European has a ban on using soy from areas that are encroaching into native tropical forest. And that's also interesting to see what the effect of that kind of policy implementation is compared to the impact of imposing a 2-degree warmer climate. And of course, it has a major impact also on the distribution of where soy comes from and also on price development. So the approach gives you quite a nice handle to also explore or benchmark other kinds of counterfactuals and to benchmark it against what climate change could do. So that is, I think, a good illustration of thinking actually that developed while we were developing and implementing this storyline. Another one that is also studied quite heavily in other sets of literatures, of course, the Harvey landfall in the US, where the red spot that you see on the map is actually, this is industrial production changes just in the, I think, 6 or 8 weeks after the Harvey landfall. And you see very clearly a negative impact on production in the area that was hit by this cyclone, because a lot of flooding took place, a lot of industry was destroyed or couldn't produce anymore, or supplies weren't there. So productivity in that area went down. But funny enough, in a global market, of course, other countries, they pick up part of that productivity. And so there's a lot of compensation of markets going on. This is, in general, is a temporary effect. So after a while, after Houston recovers, and then the rest restores also back to original situations. But we could also do quite detailed analysis of how these distributional effects, how they were distributed over smaller versus larger production units. And then you could see that for a couple of the larger units, they had a more, say, sustained post-hurricane impact on changes in the productivity capacity than the smaller ones. And that is also something I've been trained as a physical climate scientist and not as a trade modeler or industry modeler, but the trade and industry modelers that were in the consortium were very keen to have this kind of results also. And that is also published in a nice PhD thesis produced out of that. Yeah, and this is then the overview of the total ensemble, and most of them have been documented somewhere in the scientific literature, but they all are also somewhere findable in our deliverables and on the project website. Yeah, finally to close up, of course there's a large policy call from this call, and there is a lot of resilience policy in Europe that tries to mitigate this kind of risks. And some partners in the project, they really know the policy landscape much better than I do. So there was quite a lot of scanning around on what kind of policy domains are actually addressing this. And it's not, by far, not only climate policy, of course. It's also a lot on trade policy and humanitarian aid policy or infrastructure development policy. And actually, this is also a topic where it's really interesting to look at the need to have coherent policies, that the policies that are spread out over multiple directorates and multiple domains, sometimes they may have conflicting outcomes. And so this was also a procedure to sometimes stress test coherence of different policies. And we produced quite a few policy briefs also had specific entries to what we call the Inform Risk Index. That is an entity operated by GRC and ISPRA that enters, or that is actually feeding information about humanitarian needs all over the world. Where are crises and where should we put priority in responses? And via our storyline approaches, we could also make longer outlooks to these risk assessments that then indeed feed a more coherent intervention policy on this area. So, but I'm coming back to some reviewer comments on the project in a minute as well. We also built a visualizer. 6, 7, or 8 storylines are also embedded in a visualizer, and the protocol paper that you saw in the beginning of my presentation, is also implemented in the visualizer. So you are gradually getting yourself through the different steps in the definition of the storyline. So you first get a display of the scope, and then you see a display of what the teleconnection is about, and then a display of what climate change has got to do, and then a display of what the impacts in terms of socioeconomic impact indicators are at the end. And it's been tested a lot with stakeholders inside and outside of the project, and pretty well appreciated. Yeah, and finally, I think we also, I already mentioned on the right-hand side of this slide, this is what the European Climate Risk Assessment is entailing. They have decided to produce this risk assessment along 2 big streams, and the first stream is to make, say, thematic fact sheets to make a kind of a sort of a traditional risk assessment. The food system is exposed to these temperatures and these rainfall anomalies and blah blah blah, and flood risk, etc. They are all assessed. But we also they also adopted 8 or 9 different complex storylines where they gave experts room to explore how cascading and indirect effects of climate change would be able to cascade through the cycle, and that's quite interesting read as well. It's all very constrained and event driven, and but a lot of explicit attention for also indirect impacts, and that makes it a very useful framework to start a discussion about how coherent policies are and how successful mitigation activities are. It's not a risk assessment in the traditional sense is that you get a probability distribution of how likely it is that you get this kind of indirect impacts, but it's a very good talking platform to think through how sensitive your systems are. And it was very inspiring to see how the scientists and the policymakers jointly set the scope for these storylines. Yeah, and finally, both Jana and myself and some others in the consortium also were in IPCC in the 6th assessment report. And then we also promoted the use of more physical climate storylines or the event storylines as an addition to what we already have as storylines that underlie the traditional climate scenario. So also in IPCC, there's much more coverage of that as well. Yeah, and then finally, I really would like to conclude with a couple of review comments. We received them last week, and we haven't yet submitted our responses to them, but they were actually very positive about the methodology. They really see that we are doing a sort of a groundbreaking, beyond state-of-the-art development of the methodology. So there was a lot of compliments for that. But they also point at, the inevitable subjective elements in the approach, and that is, of course, totally accepted, and that's also why we are in that protocols putting so much emphasis on a proper documentation of all the assumptions and testing of the feasibility of the cascades that we find. So I think that criticism is well taken, but also accepted already in the approach. What was also interesting is that they said, well, yeah, but the policy recommendations that you do is not very in-depth. It was a bit humble or a bit shallow. And indeed, I think you can also see in this criticism that our consortium is compiled with climate experts, with a lot of, at least 40% of them in the physical climate world, and then another big set of them in climate impact assessment, and only very few that are specialized in policy making. And they would also, and I digested from this comment the suggestion that, and they made some examples of how you also could look at socioeconomic impacts, or how you also could look at how robust the financial world is. If you take different perspectives, you can come to very different conclusions about resilience of the financial sector. And I think this is an excellent demonstration that we could also apply the storyline approach, but then not to different climate conditions, but to different, say, sectoral perspectives, or different sectoral sub-elements, or different actors within the sectors, for whom these climate impacts may have quite a different work. So I think the concept in itself is very well suitable to bring more in-depth policy recommendation. But then, of course, we need much more experts on policy making and policy intervention analysis than the current consortium has. So actually, we are offering the methodology to the next generation of experts that will approach it not from a fiscal point of view, but more from a policy making point of view. Yeah, and there's also the classical discussion is that with every assessment that you provide, or every scenario that you provide, that can be described as kind of a scientific, or as an evidence-based reasoning. At some stage, someone is looking at the results and has an opinion about it. And then that opinion, of course, is not coming out of a computer, but is, of course, shaped by the values that are underneath the interpretation step. And so it's also interesting to look at the different value perspectives on how serious one would take this kind of impact change, and how eager one is to implement intervention or alternative policies to become more resilient against it. But those are very value-based and not only evidence-based. And the storyline approach makes the dialogue, I think, a bit more explicit, that at some stage the interpretation is such a big element of the approach that you come immediately into a value-based discussion if you make that interpretation. And so I also consider this review critique as a complement, because we enable a discussion about what really matters to society about climate change. And that is, I think, for scientists, the ultimate goal, to trigger a value-based discussion in society, because that's where the action needs to be born. I think that's what my story is about. And the last slide is, I think, the overview of the consortium partners. Thank you very much, and maybe sorry for rushing a bit here and there.